Hello, good morning, everyone. This is Naser Sidiqee, the Executive Director for the Biruni Institute. I welcome everyone to this program jointly organized by the Biruni Institute and University of Central Asia. The title of the program is COVID-19 Outlook and Prospects for Economic Recovery in Afghanistan. This program, jointly organized by the two institutions, will discuss the economic implications of COVID-19 and policy suggestions for economic recovery. The COVID-19 pandemic has plunged the Afghan economy into a deep recession. The economy is projected to contract by 8.2% in 2020, with the recovery rate forecast to have increased from nearly 55% in 2017 to around 72% in 2020. This is the poverty rate. Revenue collection is relatively affected by the economic slowdown, worsening the prospects for the medium-term fiscal sustainability. Furthermore, the ongoing peace process and the upcoming donor pledging conference in November 2020 in Geneva add to the growing complexities for the economic management during the crisis. Questions like how the Afghan government support economic recovery through targeted programs for the poor and private sector, given the existing fiscal constraints. What type of development programs can be most effective in terms of poverty reduction and employment generation? What implications do donor pledges in Geneva conference have for fiscal and economic stability in the country? Has enough efforts made to tap into the potentials and opportunities that the private sector offers for fiscal sustainability and economic recovery in Afghanistan? This webinar, jointly organized, will address some of these questions. The program will have two parts. The first will discuss the economic outlook by the Biruni Institute, and Dr. Joya from the Institute will present the findings of the outlook. Second part of the program, our colleague from the University of Central Asia, Dr. Roman Mogilevskii, will chair the panel with two distinguished speakers from Afghanistan, Mr. Naser Sidiqee, Director General for Coordination and Monitoring and Reporting at the Ministry of Finance, which is at the heart of the policy discussions for Geneva conference. And second, we will have a very distinguished speaker from Afghanistan Chamber of Commerce. His Excellency Hashimi, the CEO of the Chamber of Commerce, will discuss. And at the end, we will have a concluding remarks by Dr. Bodan from the University of Central Asia. We begin by the presentation by Dr. Joya.
Thank you. So as Mr. Naser Sidiqee mentioned, I'm going to present some of the main findings of the Afghanistan Economic Outlook. This is the second edition in the series, which we initiated in April this year, right at the time when COVID-19 pandemic reached Afghanistan. I have prepared a presentation and I'm going to share that on the screen. So if you could please bear with me for a few seconds. There, I hope you can see the presentation on your screens. So the outline of my presentation would be that I'll that you'll first have a brief look at the context, at the social and political context. Then I'll explain the macroeconomic developments in the first half of the year, and also provide you with an outlook for this year and next. I'll then move to presenting our forecasts and projections on unemployment. And at the end, I'll explain briefly our perspectives on on the REACH project, which was designed by the government to provide emergency support to households in the country. And this topic was included as an in-depth discussion in our latest Afghanistan Economic Outlook. For those readers who are unfamiliar, I suggest that you can access the report on our website, which we released a few weeks ago. From what we see in the official statistics on COVID-19 in Afghanistan is that the incidence curve of COVID-19 is now on a downward trend. Now, it is true that over the past few days, especially since Eid, the daily incidence rate has once again slightly peaked up, but it is difficult to make a judgment at this point in time because the sample size or the sample test that the government undertakes every day, that varies. So it's difficult to make a judgment whether there's another upward trend on the curve or not. The second point on the political front, as many of the viewers know, the political impasse over presidential elections, which continued for around 7 months of contention and negotiations, came to an end in May this year. So that addressed some of the political uncertainties in the country, but again, with the peace process, we believe that it has prevented the confidence to rebound in the country, especially with the recent surges in conflict and violence in a number of provinces. This has prevented the consumer and business confidence to rebound. Now, going to the macroeconomic outlook, the economy has fallen into a strong recession in 2020. We project that the real GDP, that the economy will contract by around 8% this year. And that's primarily the result of disruptions in supply chains and exports that have materialized as a result of the COVID-19 outbreak in spring this year in Afghanistan. But also the economic contraction or the recession is also the result of a drop in consumption, in household consumption, due to the income shock that was assumed with the COVID-19 pandemic. From the anecdotal reports that we have seen is that there have been widespread suspension in production activities in the country in the second quarter of this year. Sectors such as manufacturing, construction, restaurants, and transportation were the sectors that were mostly affected. But agriculture, we believe that agriculture sector is going to post a positive growth this year of about 2.6%. And that's because that Afghanistan had an above average precipitation levels in winter and spring this year. So we expect a fairly good wheat harvest for this year. So with that, we are likely to have a positive agriculture growth this year. But this 2.6% positive growth in the agriculture sector is not enough to compensate the negative growth or the contractions that we have seen in industries and services sectors. And especially with the absence of risk insurance mechanisms in the country and lack of fiscal stimulus, the impact of COVID-19 on the Afghan economy has been quite substantial. Now, Afghanistan is not, of course, alone in the region with having assumed such implications or such impact by the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that countries in the region, such as India or Iran, are also going to contract very strongly. India is projected to contract by 4.5% and Iran by 6%. And these projections come from the IMF. But it doesn't mean that we could directly compare Afghanistan with those countries, because the economic structure and characteristics of these countries are different. And then, and also these growth rates relate to the fiscal years that are very different from one country to another. With this, we believe that an economic recovery, assuming that the second wave of the pandemic will not take place, that the COVID-19 incidence curve does not pick up again, we expect an economic recovery in spring next year. So that would be the second quarter of next year. So the so the chart on your left shows the economic growth rate since 2003. And you see that economic growth fell to around 1 to 2% since 2014, with the completion of the security transition in the country, right at the time when most of the international troops withdrew from the country. And for next year, we expect economic growth to scale back to a positive trajectory to 0.6%, although that's a very small growth to have. And the chart on your right that shows the revisions to growth projections that took place since March this year. Initially, most institutions expected a positive growth for 2020 for Afghanistan. But then in our first release of the Afghanistan Economic Outlook, we went out with projections for two different scenarios. One was a moderate scenario for COVID-19, and the other was a very severe and acute projection. And in the severe scenario for COVID-19, we projected an economic contraction of 9 to 10% back then. And slowly, the IMF and World Bank have also revised their projections to negative territory along the lines. In the second quarter, we have also seen a strong decline in trade. Exports dropped.
Dear colleagues, while we have a pause, I suggest we move to the panel discussion, and then when our colleagues from Biruni Institute are back online, we will complete their presentation. Well, I think it's all understandable. So we have two excellent commentators for this topic today, and let me proceed with introducing them. Mr. Naser Sidiqee has been working with the Ministry of Finance as Director General for Coordination, Monitoring and Reporting for over a year now. He has previously worked as Senior Technical Anti-Corruption Advisor for Office of the Chief Executive and as Deputy Program Director for GIZ's Open Policy Advisory Fund. Mr. Sidiqee has also been a lecturer at Dunya University of Afghanistan from 2015 to 2019. Mr. Sidiqee's professional work focuses on public policy and economic development since 2011. He has worked for many national and international non-governmental organizations, UN agencies, and government in Kabul.
Roman,
yes.
Roman,
yes.
Our colleagues are back on back. And so the next time, our dear friend, Mr. Sidiqee, will not have to be reintroduced.
Yeah, well, okay, thanks. So, Omar, are you ready to continue?
Yes, our apologies for getting disconnected. It doesn't happen so often, but connections sometimes are unstable here in Kabul. So I can resume with the presentation. So exports in the second quarter of the year had a significant decline. Exports dropped to about $30 million US, and that's a significant fall compared to $200 million in the first quarter of the year, or $150 million US that was recorded in the second quarter of last year. The exports in the second quarter of this year were primarily because of a fall in global demand, but also as a result of the disruptions that took place in international transportation. Going to inflation, prices increased in the first half of the year. Headline inflation increased from about 4% in January to about 8% in April, to nearly 9% in April, and then moderated to 6.4%. And this increase in inflation was primarily because of rising food prices. And we expect that this trend to continue. We expect an upward but a steady trend in inflation throughout the year. We expect headline inflation to be about 6.8% this year, with food prices inflation reaching 13%. Now, the fiscal sector, with the economic contraction, revenues have had a sharp decline. Revenue collection in the first half of the year amounted to 77 billion Afghanis, and that's about 17% lower than the revenues that were collected in the same period in previous year. So if this trend continues, we expect revenues to reach 144 billion AFs, which will be about 30% lower than last year's levels. And if we look from in percentage of GDP, this shows a 4 percentage point drop in revenues, meaning that revenues will decline from 13.5% of GDP that was in 2019 to about 9.5% of GDP this year. So this is the level of revenues that were collected back in 2015. So revenues actually fell back to the levels of 4 to 5 years ago. But then as the revenue collection was much less this year, donors mobilized additional resources for the government to help the government with its discretionary resources needs, because the government is actually very much reliant on donor funding. About 60% of the government budget is financed by donor grants. Now, when revenues fall, it puts an extreme pressure on the budget, on the budget financing. So what has happened so far is that the donors undertook, reallocated and restructured most of the donor projects per request by the government, in order to free up some of the donor money in order to finance either COVID-19 related projects or to provide the government with discretionary resources. But what has also happened is that donors have front-loaded some of their grant disbursements through the ARTF. And for those who are unfamiliar with the ARTF, so it's Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund, and it is the biggest trust fund in Afghanistan in which donors contribute. And the ARTF finances both the development projects, but it also provides the government with discretionary resources. So far, about $500 million have been reallocated under the ARTF to COVID response projects. An additional $420 million is mobilized as discretionary resources through the government. But just to clarify, except for $320 million, which includes a long-term concessional credit by the IMF, no other new grants are committed to Afghanistan. So whatever that has been disbursed to Afghanistan is either coming from the existing grant commitments to the country or are the result of a portfolio restructuring, which means that some of the projects have been restructured or even canceled in order to free up some of the donor grants to COVID-19 projects. And with the growing expenditure needs this year, and in order to address the COVID-19 pandemic, the fiscal deficit is projected to increase to about $500 million this year. And this is despite the additional grant commitments or grant disbursements, the additional grant disbursements that have been provided to the government. The budget amendment for this year increased the budget by about 14 billion, 15 to 20 billion AFs. And we expect that by the end of the year, overall public spending to be slightly higher than last year's of about 4% compared to last year. Now, we know that the government is planning to finance this deficit by its cash reserves, but we believe that it's going to be quite challenging because most cash reserves sitting in the Treasury account, some of them come from the security grants, which are restricted cash reserves. But then at the end, the money is fungible. But despite that, we believe that throughout the year, the government might be accumulating some significant amounts of arrears, which will be carried forwarded to next year. Now, coming to poverty and unemployment, the World Bank went out with a poverty forecast a month ago. And according to them, poverty rates is projected to increase from nearly 55% that was in 2017 to about 72% this year. Now, we think that this is still based on conservative assumptions because first, it assumes that the shock affects only the remittances, and we know that the remittances represent only a small chunk of household income in Afghanistan. And second, it assumes that income or consumption remains stable over 2017 to 2019, which we think that that's a very conservative assumption because the growth rate, the GDP per capita, did actually decline in those years. So meaning that perhaps poverty rate could be could go beyond 72% in 2020 if we were to consider some more realistic assumptions. On unemployment, according to our analysis and forecasts, which come from a multiplier model that we developed based on a social accounting matrix for Afghanistan, unemployment and underemployment together are forecast to increase from nearly 40% in 2017 to about 53.5% this year by the end of the year. So of course, this includes both unemployment and underemployment. And the reason that we include underemployment here is that in countries like Afghanistan, working just for 2 or 3 hours in a week, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't provide people with a level of income that would be sufficient to meet their needs. So in developing countries or low-income countries, I think underemployment does need to be considered. So this means that by the end of the year, there will be around 4.8 million people either unemployed or underemployed in the country. And this is an increase of about 1.5 million compared to the number of people that were unemployed and underemployed back in 2017. Now, let me clarify that this is still based on very conservative assumptions, because in this forecast, we assume that unemployment rate remained constant and stable between 2017 and 2019, which we think is actually extremely conservative. But 55%, 53.5% of unemployment and underemployment is actually quite a considerable rate. Now, finally, and this is my last slide, we had a brief discussion on the proposed project by the government on emergency support to households and households and communities, which is called REACH project, or in Dari it is labeled as the Starfone Milli. So it's about $300 million project or $280 million project that is designed by the government and the World Bank. And we believe that such a project is actually justified. There is an enormous need for having such an emergency support program to households in the country. And we also believe that the government's approach in terms of reallocating resources across the existing development portfolio and moving them to finance this project is also justified, given the need that is out there for such a program. But we think that the type and the structure of the program, which currently consists of in-kind distribution of food, needs to be reconsidered for reasons of efficiency, effectiveness, and transparency. We think that better alternatives could have been a cash transfer program based on mobile money or digital currency. And we all know that in everywhere around the world, programs that involve digital cash transfer had lower implementation and logistical costs. They also have greater effectiveness in terms of poverty reduction. Fiduciary risks are also low in these sort of operations, and also transparency is much higher. And I think with the higher propensity to corruption, fraud, and misuse of projects that involve in-kind distribution of food, mobile money or digital cash could have been a much better alternative, because the government already had an unsuccessful experience with previous projects that involved distributing bread and wheat in Kabul city, and again doing another project at this scale would be prone to the risks of corruption, quality concerns, and so on. But even and we think that a cash transfer program involving mobile money is completely feasible in the country, because the technological infrastructure and the technological prerequisites is fully in place in the country, according to our assessment. And with having a telecom coverage of 90% of the population here in the country, I mean, we don't see any significant challenges that would have been there for such a program. But even if the government were not willing to do a cash transfer program, still it could have used a hybrid program, meaning that part of the funds could have been distributed to the households and communities using the existing government's payroll system, where there are more than 1 million payroll accounts in the country, and especially targeting the lower segment of the civil servants, which earn, let's say, about less than 12 to 15,000 AFS per month. And also the government could have used the pension benefit scheme, which have completely been modernized using biometric system and bank accounts. And this also includes the social benefits to the families of martyrs and disabled. So with this, you could have covered a big chunk of the population. And finally, those who would have remained uncovered with such a transfer program, the government could have offered a cash for work program to people who neither fall under government's payroll, who nor receive any social benefits through the pension or the martyrs and disabled program. And then in the remote areas, in villages or remote communities where markets are underdeveloped, the government could have distributed food in kind. So we believe that both options could have been possible and could have been a much better alternative. So this was our overall messages in this edition of the Afghanistan Economic Outlook. And for those who have not seen the report, I encourage them to have a look at the report, which is available on our website. So I end my presentation here. I'm not sure if we are able to receive any questions, which I doubt that, but I hand over now to Dr. Roman Mogilevskii to chair the next panel.
Thank you very much, Dr. Joya, for this very interesting, comprehensive, and yet concise presentation. Now let's proceed with our panel. I already had a chance to present our first speaker, Mr. Naser Sidiqee. Let me also introduce the second speaker, and then we will proceed with their comments, and then question and answer session. Meantime, if people have questions to any of the presenters, hopefully to Dr. Joy and to two commenters, please write them in the question and answer session of your Zoom software. So Mr. Saeed Zaman Hashimi has been elected as the Chief Executive Officer for the Afghanistan Chamber of Commerce and Investment on 14th of December 2019. Before that, Mr. Hashimi used to work as Director General for the Legal Department of the Ministry of Justice of Afghanistan and leading formal justice development in Afghanistan. He is one of the top mining commercial lawyers of Afghanistan. He has graduated from Kabul University's Faculty of Law and has supplemented his undergraduate education with master's degree in public administration from Syracuse University and master's degree in law from the University of Denver. And he worked a lot on different aspects of mining, oil and gas, and the different aspects of natural resource agreements. So with that, let me pass the floor to Mr. Sidiqee.
Thank you so much to all the colleagues at IPPA and University of Central Asia, as well as Biruni Institute. It's a pleasure to be here and speaking with all you distinguished characters in your field. I also would like to congratulate the IPPA and University of Central Asia, as well as Biruni Institute, for organizing this very important webinar on the impacts of COVID-19 in Afghanistan. I think speaking after Dr. Joya's presentation, in which he probably very rightly painted a very grim picture of the economy of Afghanistan, it will be very difficult for me to paint a different picture, but nevertheless, I will try to establish a connection between the economic situation of Afghanistan and the upcoming ministerial conference, which we are planning to organize later this year together with our international partners. Let me start by saying that the economic situation in Afghanistan, and I think around the world, is very well known to almost everybody, especially policymakers in the development field. And the government of Afghanistan has been very active in taking stock of developments during this period, and has been trying ever since to come up with strategies and policy solutions to address the situation, not just in the short term, as was discussed by Dr. Joya, but also in the medium term as well as long term in front of us. I'm not aware if I have to address any specific questions under this topic, which I was asked to address during this webinar, but I am going to provide a comprehensive picture of what the ministerial conference is going to be about, and how the ministerial conference will pave the way not only for economic recovery and development in Afghanistan in the second half of transformation decade, but also how this development initiatives and interventions are linked and can be supplemented or sort of reinforced by peace programming. So if I just start by the ministerial conference, we have these ministerial conferences usually take place every 2 years in the form of a high-level policy dialogue between the government of Afghanistan and our international donors and development partners. I think the foundation of these ministerial conferences were laid in the post-2001 era, but has taken a more regular and formalized form since 2012 in Tokyo. And we have had almost 4 or 5 conferences, and this will be probably another conference in the same format. For the government of Afghanistan to address the economic difficulties of Afghanistan, this has been very much in line with the principles of aid effectiveness. The government, as the recipient of international financial assistance, we have to come up with actionable policy strategies for a limited period of time, usually for 3 to 5 years. And we have to present that strategy to our international partners, based on which our international partners commit not just financial assistance, but in some areas also technical assistance for that specific period to the government and people of Afghanistan. In 2020, despite the challenges that we have all experienced and faced due to COVID-19, the government of Afghanistan accelerated its efforts to present a strategy document to our international donors and development partners. We call that the second Afghanistan National Peace and Development Framework. This framework builds on the existing Afghanistan National Peace and Development Framework, which was developed in 2017 and was expected to cover the period of 2017 until 2021. Since the situation has changed a lot, not just here in Afghanistan, in many aspects, which I will come back to, but also across the world in terms of their ability to provide predictable and sustained financial assistance to Afghanistan, given the impact of COVID-19 on their economies. The government of Afghanistan considered revising the existing strategy and presented the draft during the July 28 senior officials meeting to our international partners, which covers the period of 2021 to 2025. Now, I must highlight this, that the period of 2020 to 2025 will be the second half of our transformation decade, which was envisioned in the self-reliance strategy, which was presented in 2014 by the government of Afghanistan. The ministerial conference in this document that we have presented to our international partners, and the consultations are ongoing. The government of Afghanistan has tried to combine the development agenda with the peace process that has been ongoing for some time now. The expectation both from the government and people of Afghanistan, as well as from the international partners, are to make sure that both international partners and the government invest on the peace dividend as a driver of economic growth in the second half of transformation decade. By that I mean, although, as I said earlier, Dr. Joya, he presented a very grim picture of the economic situation in Afghanistan, but I also think there are opportunities hidden in the challenges that we all face. And the government of Afghanistan has been very active in recognizing those opportunities and has been very diligent in banking on those opportunities to make sure that we can use those opportunities to not only continue the momentum that was created for economic growth, but also add value to that momentum. In the sense that, given the analysis presented by Dr. Joya, the economic situation definitely is going to feel a very significant shock during 2020. As has been discussed by the World Bank colleagues in their Afghanistan Development Update, by the Biruni Institute, the IMF, and many other institutes and organizations that has been tracking and collecting information on the situation. However, I think what the government of Afghanistan is considering to present to our international partners, considering their own economic limitations, is that while we are facing the pandemic and we have to make sure that we not only provide relief to the people of Afghanistan in the short term, but also make sure that the economy can recover in a sustainable manner over the medium term and long term periods. We bank on the peace dividends, as I said earlier, to make sure that we have an accelerated growth than what can be estimated or projected over the next 5 years. And in that sense, I think the government of Afghanistan has highlighted key, excuse me, has highlighted key program areas and policy areas on which not only the government would like to focus, but has encouraged our international partners to also support government's priorities, but also sort of interlink peace programming and peace program interventions with the development agenda in a way that both development and peace can mutually reinforce each other. If I put this in a layman's word, although the economic situation specifically from an economic perspective would take a longer time to recover and reach the levels of growth that we have been experiencing since the security transition in 2014. But we're also aware that if peace process succeeds and there is a political settlement between the government of Islamic Republic of Afghanistan and the Taliban movement, that will provide more conducive environment for further and accelerated investment, which can accelerate the pace of growth over the next 5 years. Meanwhile, what I think the government of Afghanistan has this time been very straightforward about with our international partners is the way off-budget funding allocations are being managed and expended here in Afghanistan. We have been tracking and collecting information on the management, transparency, and effectiveness of off-budget programs by our international partners, and we have recommended to them that we need to agree on a new set of rules of the game going forward, in which the development partners can, of course, based on their own estimates and analysis, consider allocation of funds either through country systems or through off-budget expanding. However, the government has demonstrated readiness to address a majority of our donors' concerns in terms of procurement, in terms of fiduciary risks, to make sure that we earn more credibility among our international partners. And by that, our international partners can increase allocation of financial assistance using country systems. And I think that's also going to be a major part of discussion in leading up to the conference with our international partners, but during the conference as well. In terms of mutual accountability, which is another major topic during the ministerial conference this year, as has been over the past few years, the government of Afghanistan has shown strong commitment to addressing one of the most significant concerns of our international partners, and that is corruption. We have taken significant measures in terms of creating a conducive legal environment to deal with the issue of corruption and to deliver justice. But we recognize that there is, of course, need for doing more, and most specifically in terms of tangible and acceptable outputs. So the government will now move on from formulation of policies and strategies and providing a conducive legal environment to implementation. The government has suggested in the strategy, as we have shared with our international partners, that the government will move swiftly to establish the Anti-Corruption Commission, which has been a subject of discussion between the government and our international partners. We're also going to go ahead with the execution of arrest warrants for some of the most corrupt government officials. But we also present to our international partners that transparency and accountability needs to be upheld by our international partners as well when it comes to off-budget financial assistance in Afghanistan. And we have already initiated discussions with them on individual and bilateral basis. And during the ministerial conference, I think this will be up for discussion with all our international partners. I think on the outcomes of the ministerial conference in terms of what we expect from our international partners in terms of financial assistance to provide to Afghanistan, it would probably be too soon to give an exact figure. However, given the circumstances and given the needs of Afghanistan, of course, we're being mindful of the limitations on the part of our international partners. The government of Afghanistan has presented a clear strategy, and we have identified major priority areas in which we would like to seek financial assistance. But this financial assistance, as we have been talking about, will of course be backed up by focus on increasing and improving domestic revenue mobilization. As I said earlier, addressing corruption will to some extent address also the issue of declining domestic revenue mobilization. And we have estimates and analysis that if we can address effectively the issue of corruption in our domestic revenue collection, the government of Afghanistan will be able to mobilize a significant amount of domestic revenue to create a financial and fiscal space for its development agenda. I think we are also working with our international partners to come up with the next mutual accountability framework, which will replace Geneva Mutual Accountability Framework. And as we discussed during the senior officials meeting, the new framework, there is a general consensus that should be more focused on strategic and priority areas and should have a specific number and manageable number of indicators focusing on reforms in the private sector, of course, women empowerment, dealing with corruption and governance, but also upholding the basic principles of aid effectiveness as was enshrined in the Paris Declaration. There are some responsibilities that our international partners will have to make those their highest priority. And then I think we will have a good outcome if we move in that same direction as we have charted the course for the pledging conference. I don't know how much time is allocated for me. I can continue discussing on the specifics of the pledging conference or any detail that is required from the second Afghanistan National Peace and Development Framework. But I will leave that to the question and answer session, and I will stop here. So thank you for the opportunity once again.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sidiqee. It's really interesting and a very valuable contribution to our webinar today. Yes, and now let me give the floor to Mr. Hashimi for his comments, please.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Mr. Naser Kabiri and very distinguished colleagues from Ministry of Finance and of course the Central Asian University. Thank you so much for this great event and this great conference. And thank you so much for having me to comment on this very important event. So I will briefly discuss the current situation of impact of COVID-19 on the private sector of Afghanistan, and of course, our recommendations to the government of Afghanistan, and also the role of ACCI during past 4 months of COVID-19 impact on Afghan economy. So, of course, Afghanistan reported its first COVID-19 case at the end of February 2020, following the wave of returnees from Iran who had left in response to the deteriorating economic situation. Herat, Kabul, and Nangarhar provinces went through a complete lockdown for nearly 2 months. Other affected provinces enforced partial lockdowns. Although the full lockdown ended, but partial lockdown continued across the country, meaning business continued to experience difficulties. During past 4 months, ACCI has played a very important role in our provincial chambers throughout Afghanistan. Of course, we have provincial chambers in 26 provinces of Afghanistan. They have convened an emergency board meetings, and of course, they have stimulated and encouraged their members to the extent they could play an active role in supporting the Afghan economy and of course the poor people. Especially, we have started distributing food donations to the most poor families and to the most vulnerables across the country. And in the meantime, we've been busy talking to the government and proposing and suggesting that they have to leave the borders open with Uzbekistan mainly, and of course bringing very essential food products coming from Uzbekistan and Pakistan, and of course Iran. So the first experience was that the government should have had developed a food strategic stock in the country, because of course it's a country of importing very essential food products from outside the country, and such a critical time of coronavirus in our nation, our neighboring countries have started sealing their borders with Afghanistan and do not letting to import very essential products from outside Afghanistan, mainly the medical products from Pakistan coming through Karachi to Afghanistan. So that was the worst experience that we had. We've been struggling and fighting with so many other, of course, agencies who have played a role in lockdowning and sealing the borders with Afghanistan. So that had created a panic at the market and caused increase of the prices in the country. So our members throughout Afghanistan has played a very important role, immediately taking out all stocked foods, their stocked foods, so to the market to control the prices and do not let the price to increase, and especially that would have had huge impact on the poor and vulnerable families. So, so overall, 3.5 million USD has been donated in terms of food packages and medical equipment to the Ministry of Health, and also throughout the country to the hospitals and to the vulnerable families. Of course, we have listed that our members throughout Afghanistan has donated food to the 70,000 poor families. So, of course, at this time, some of the borders with Iran, Pakistan were occasionally reopened for food imports and returning immigrants. With all other country borders closed, especially for sometimes we experienced very tough time with Pakistan, closing their borders on Afghan transit cargoes, on Afghan export commodities. We also discussed these issues with government, with our international community partners to support the private sector of Afghanistan. So the huge, and according to the World Bank report, the 80% of Afghan economic activities or the revenues has been paid by SMEs of Afghanistan. We don't have a large corporates in the country. These are very few large corporates. So 80% revenue comes from SMEs. So means there has to be special support and a special strategic plan for supporting SMEs of the country during the very tragic time of COVID-19, hugely impacting SMEs. So according to the survey conducted by ACCI and together with our international partners, we have found out that 30% of SMEs are now out of the business. So that's a huge impact. Even one of our largest corporation, which is Tolo TV, they have said the rate of unemployment, what they have told to me is like more than 17%. Only they have, what is that? Fired 17% of their employees. Means the impact, the negative impact of COVID-19 is huge on the Afghan economy. So that's one of the large corporations that I have given the example of that. So the whole economy has been broadly impacted by COVID-19. Unemployment is at a record level globally. And of course, Mr. Joya has comprehensively talked about that and recorded that. Has slowed down the survival levels. COVID-19 will have an additional impact on the strained official and informal labor market, with returning migrants seeking employment and businesses experiencing reduced revenue. Some up to 90% are halting operation. The IMF expects that the economy to contract by around 3% in this year. Of course, growth of roughly the same magnitude in 2019. Almost half of the state budget is financed by donors, including 37% by the United States. Of course, however, despite the low public debt of 7% of GDP, Afghanistan is classified as being at the high risk of external debt distress. However, we have proposed, with realizing the huge impact of COVID-19 on the private sector of Afghanistan, all the chambers and private sector business leaders came together, and we have prepared a strategic plan and proposed to the government of Afghanistan for the long-term, mid-term, and short-term that should be considered to support and to revitalize the Afghan small businesses back again into the market. So the private sector recommendations for COVID-19 economic support. We have suggested that the government of Afghanistan increase government spending on the public health sector to strengthen the health system. That was, of course, at the time of emergency. Suspension of business tax payments. The government was dealing and treating private sector that we are in a normal situation. Of course, we were an emergency situation. We have suggested and proposed to the government of Afghanistan, let whatever food products willing to come to Afghanistan, let them to come, because we do not want to face a catastrophe at the time of COVID-19. If all the borders closed with Afghanistan, mainly the food products, the main essential products coming from Pakistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and other Central Asian countries, we will definitely face a human catastrophe. So we never seen and never experienced an immediate action by the government to release the taxation on the import of essential products coming from abroad. And also pensions and municipal taxes should be released. Review the tax policy should have been done by the government, and tax incentives should be given and stimulate industrialization and agriculture and mining in the country. This is actually a very general recommendation for the long term in the country. Payroll protection schemes such as employees, holidays, and of course, temporary and universal income to the households. Cash grants to farms. Cut interest rates, launch schemes to increase liquidity within the economy and banking system to fund recovery programs and lending schemes. Increased public infrastructure spendings with the temporary cash for work schemes, and of course to support the rural population across the provinces. These were actually our recommendations we have put forward and recommended to the government like almost a month ago. But we see some of these recommendations are now in realization. And of course, Dr. Julia has already mentioned about the Dastarkhane Milli, that national projects. We will talk about the effectiveness of that project. We've been discussing this several times among the private sector entities and discussing that this amount of money should have been spent in a much more effective way on the private sector. It should have been invested on a large infrastructure project. Currently, private sector, especially the traders of Afghanistan, are suffering from corruption and from lack of sufficient and proper infrastructures, especially the custom infrastructure in Torkham, in Spinboldak, in Herat, in Farah, and so many other ports, dry ports of the country. But this money, this amount of $300 million should have been spent on those infrastructures. And that infrastructures could have increased employment, could have increased revenue to the government. But now, lack of infrastructure and lack of proper system installation in the custom department and the custom departments at the borders has caused huge corruption. And every day there are challenges faced by our traders. And of course, our trades are now based on a very traditional way we're trading with Pakistan. We have asked the government of Afghanistan, yes, we do have a bilateral trade agreement with Pakistan. That's not actually covering the trade. That's only about the transit with Pakistan. And Pakistan has sealed their border a month ago to the export of Afghanistan. And our traders were begging the embassies, the government officials, the government agencies to open the border for the fresh fruit of Afghanistan. This is a fresh fruit season in the country. We did not experience during past 20 years, did not experience a stable commercial and trade relation with Pakistan. And this commercial relation has been facing many challenges, and it was always impacted by a political tension between either Pakistan of Afghanistan or Pakistan and India. So of course, it's unfortunate for the country being a landlocked country. We are, yes, thanks to the government of Afghanistan for signing Chabahar agreements and Lapis Lazuli agreements. These are very good corridors, but still not a functionable and not an operational corridors for the trade export of Afghanistan, traders of Afghanistan. So we are facing many challenges, technical challenges, legal challenges, when our traders goes through Chabahar to take their commodities and their products to India. And the same thing, we're experiencing the same challenges through Lapis Lazuli. These requires, of course, infrastructural development at the border, dry ports within Afghanistan. And of course, at the international level, the government of Afghanistan needs to take a very serious action, signing bilateral trade agreement, bilateral custom agreement, bilateral transportation agreement, bilateral and trilateral transit agreement with those countries that are involved in these corridors. mainly Chabahar and Lapis Lazuli, which is very important connecting Afghanistan to Europe. But still, it's not a well-functioning corridor for the Afghan traders and for the Afghanistan exports. So basically, Iran and some of the Central Asian countries are competing with our products, going to the Central Asian markets. So therefore, it requires, of course, as I earlier mentioned, bilateral trade agreement and trilateral trade agreement with these countries. So to allow the product of Afghanistan go through their territories to their international markets. So in the meantime, we used to have a very good platform of channel of communication, a single window of communication for the private sector with the government. Now the private sector of Afghanistan is lost because the PISEC was a good platform, supported and developed by the support of international community, especially the donor community, mainly the World Bank. So now there's no PISEC, which was a good platform chaired by former chief executive. But now we do not have a single window of communication talking to the government. Of course, there was a special envoy of the president, Mr. Gazanfar. So he's no longer among us. So this is one of the other challenges that the private sector were facing, sending their planning, their requests, their strategies to be considered by the government at the tragic time of COVID-19. So of course, this was one of the main issues discussed with the donor community, that such a platform or such a channel should be developed again by the government as a single window of communication with the private sector of Afghanistan. So now the government has realized that they need to renovate the infrastructure at the custom borders. This is still a good initiative, and they can take this action. So we are hoping that, of course, government must have realized that that 80% of our fresh fruits and export product goes to Pakistan. So our products does requires high standard packaging system, and of course, a lot of certificates, which is a function of government agencies. They need to take care of that, especially the Ministry of Agriculture and Ministry of Commerce. They need to develop a lot of strategies and of course, agreements with so many countries around us and of course, our international partners to ease the export of Afghan products to the international markets. When we are so much relying on our export and our import on Pakistan, why we are not able to sit down with them to negotiate a new APTA agreement? We do have Afghanistan-Pakistan trade and transit agreement, which is already expired, need to be renewed, need to be negotiated, and need to be amended to ease the Afghan transit and Afghan export through Pakistan, of course, to India. So this is one of the main challenges. So we believe as a private sector of Afghanistan that our trade in our export and imports are based on very traditional way of business with either of these countries. So this needs an immediate attention and immediate action by the government of Afghanistan. We've been talking to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Commerce, and Minister of Agriculture. So during past 20 years, we've been relying so much on our export on Pakistan and import on Pakistan, because going through Chabahar is a huge challenge. Going through Lapis Lazuli, there is a huge technical issues. They do not give us a visa or do not let us go through their territories. So therefore, it requires an immediate attention and action of the government of Afghanistan. If we do not have a market in Pakistan, if we cannot they seal their border with this small political tension. So what should we do? And our farmers were saying to us, we've been requesting so many times by the government and pushing by the government policies that we should not go with the poppy cultivation, and we have to turn our farms into and of course agricultural products. Now where are the markets where we should send our products? To which market? So if Pakistan seals their border, we cannot send our products to anywhere else because we cannot meet the standards of European markets. Pakistan Iran do not let us to go to the territory, go to Chabahar. There's lack of infrastructure in Chabahar, lack of many other cooling centers and large scanners and so many other infrastructures. And of course, in Chabahar, so where we can send these products. That was a kind of crisis experienced by our traders. So these were all unfortunate that we've been experiencing during the past 4 or 5 months of COVID-19, with a huge impact on our economy, especially on our SMEs and small enterprises, and mainly the women-owned businesses in the country. We did prepare this strategic planning of 20 pages altogether with the support of some of our donor partners, and send it to the government of Afghanistan to be considered and to be reviewed, and of course to be applied within the rules and policies and regulations of the government. Still no luck hearing from the government, but they're still working on it. But of course they should have taken an immediate action in response to this tragic impact on our SMEs. So that's for the moment, that's all from my side. If there's any questions, so I'd be happy to respond. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hashimi. Very, very interesting, and it is important for our discussion to have to hear a voice from private sector of the country. Well, we are now coming to the question and answer session. Let me just, before that, to provide one comment on what I have heard so far from Dr. Joe and Mr. Sidiqee and Mr. Hashimi. Well, it might not be as obvious as it comes now that the issues are very similar in Afghanistan and in some of its northern neighbors. We monitor closely what is going on in Kyrgyzstan, in Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, and many of the issues you were discussing are exactly those issues which the economies of Central Asia face. So, well, for example, how to provide support to households. Dr. Joe was talking about the trade-off between food versus cash, and we also advocating for cash schemes here, and not very successful so far, frankly speaking. And there were also discussions of the budget gap in the budget financing in Afghanistan, same in Kyrgyzstan, same in Tajikistan. And the closure of borders for exports or imports discussed by Mr. Hashimi, same here. So, well, we have this lesson for me personally is that we have more in common than it's traditionally been acknowledged. With that, I invite everybody to ask questions from all our 3 speakers using the Q&A option on your screen. So far, we have only 1 question. You need to type in your question if you would like to ask it. So far, we have 1 question to Mr. Sidiqee. It's asked by our UCA colleague in Afghanistan, Rahman Nazar Farhat. He is asking for what are the sustainable strategies to keep investors in Afghanistan, or don't allow investors to leave the country, taking into account that already so many people left it. So, Mr. Sidiqee, if you would like to respond, you are more than welcome.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank my colleague and friend, Mr. Hashimi, for the very informative discussion. And I think what I'm going to briefly reflect on what he just said. I will directly address if there are any graduate students from the University of Central Asia. I saw in the participants list. I don't know how many of those are students who are studying economic policy or public policy. So there you have hands-on experience that policy formulation and policy execution during the studies are one thing, and when you come to the execution field, there are certain challenges that should all help you when you are continuing your studies and hopefully planning to enter the job market and advise your respective employers on how to deal with these issues. With regards to the question, I would like to thank our colleague for raising this, and I think I should have covered this in my initial remarks, but nevertheless, it was an important question. For the long term, I will break down my answer in 3 categories of long term, medium term, and short term, measures to make sure that we have we not only encourage more and more investors to come to Afghanistan and invest here in Afghanistan in different sectors, but also those who have already invested here in Afghanistan, encourage them to stay and expand their portfolios. For the long term, as I discussed in my initial remarks, I think peace is a major factor. If the government of Afghanistan and the insurgents reach a political settlement, this will have major dividends for Afghanistan, but of course for the region and the world. I will leave the security aspect of it out of today's discussion, but focusing on the economic aspect, one of the first things that a peace settlement with the insurgents would do is that it will free up territorial space for further investment. As we know, there are certain parts of the country which are beyond the control of government, and those have huge economic potentials for investment. And I think reaching a political settlement will have a multiplier effect in terms of stimulating and accelerating economic growth by providing risk guarantees to the investors to come to Afghanistan and choose their area of interest and expertise and invest here. So that will be for the long term, but I think I wouldn't call it long term in the sense that it is far distant. Peace has never been more reachable than we speculate now, but of course implementing the peace agreement will also take some time, and then probably investors will have an opportunity to come and invest here in Afghanistan. For the short term, what the government has made it its top priority is to fight crimes in major cities. I think increased levels of crime in major cities has been one of the major discouragements or disincentives for the investors to come to Afghanistan, especially in the major cities, and invest, which of course provides opportunities for job creation, economic growth, as well as domestic revenue mobilization. So the government of Afghanistan, I think in the course of past few weeks that we have been discussing with the senior most officials of the government chaired by His Excellency the President, the government has been focusing on fighting rapidly and effectively crimes in major cities to allow for investors to have a conducive environment and assurances for themselves, for their investments, and for their families to stay in Afghanistan and continue operating their businesses. For the medium term, I think what the government has also recommended in the strategy that we shared with our international donors and development partners is to promote import substitution. My colleague Hashimi said, he talked a lot about Afghanistan's dependence on imports and how political interactions and relations between our neighbors impact imports in Afghanistan. The government has been long planning to substitute imports with domestic production, and that will remain a major focus area in the years to come. I think several years back, the government did take the initiation of substituting food items in major government enterprises like Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Interior, replacing imported food items with domestically produced food items. And now I think our National Security and Defense Forces meal is completely nationally produced. So that is a major transition. And I think the government will continue to do so, given the fact that in 2014, the government of Afghanistan joined World Trade Organization with the assumption that it will provide a level playing field for the government of Afghanistan to benefit from its charter and to allow for Afghanistan's products to be equally competitive in the global market. However, we have seen that most of our World Trade Organization members have had very restrictive policy measures and protective policy measures, which did not allow for the products of Afghanistan to actually even enter the global market, let alone compete at that level. In terms of development, I think the government of Afghanistan has considered, and now we are trying to institutionalize a new sort of phrase for the private sector. We call it market. And in the new strategy, the government of Afghanistan have considered as one of its building or cornerstones market building, under which we have several priority areas. So I'm sure that will also encourage, if implemented effectively and supported by our international partners, regional countries, and our neighbors, for the investors to come to Afghanistan and utilize the opportunities that we present. Likewise, the government, in terms of development, have considered revising and reviewing the governance and implementation of existing national priority programs, in which private sector has been one of the major players. And by that revision, I think the government is trying to create a very conducive environment for the private sector and market players to be part of the government's development programming, supported not just from the government, but also by our international partners. Examples of such an intervention was, I think, discussed by Dr. Joya's presentation, and also touched upon by Mr. Hashimi. During the COVID-19 pandemic, I think the private sector played a very major role in providing rapid and immediate relief to Afghan individuals and households. And this was an interaction that I think was never experienced between the Afghanistan government and the private sector actors. So that will continue to be the same, but we will invest further to make sure that the environment is more conducive and they can play a major role. Government has been planning for a very long time to make sure that a bulk of job creation opportunities are created by the private sector players rather than the government as the major employer in the country. And I think we will continue to do that. We have developed strategies by our Ministry of Commerce and Industries, Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Mines and Petroleum. The legal frameworks and policy frameworks are established, and now we are focusing on implementation to make sure that they can contribute to the economy of Afghanistan. Regional connectivity, I think, has been a foundation of Afghanistan's interaction with the world, and it will continue to be a focus area in the years to come, specifically in the second half of transformation decade. We have several major regional and global projects, economic projects, like TOPI, which His Excellency the President just yesterday mentioned that TOPI will, implementation of TOPI project in Afghanistan, that is Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India gas pipeline. Implementation in Afghanistan will start this year, so it will require major investment, not just from global players, but also domestic private sector players in Afghanistan. And we have the CASA 1000 project, I think Lapis Lazuli, as was raised by Mr. Hashimi. We will have to further discuss the challenges and find out ways and suitable solutions to allow investors to continue operating here in Afghanistan. In addition,
we have a few more questions, so could you please complete? Yes,
I will quickly conclude by raising two more important points. What the government of Afghanistan through this strategy have been advocating for is that from the 2020 pledging conference, we are trying to diversify the nature of our interaction with our international partners. So far, the main form of our relationship has been aid financing, and the government of Afghanistan is now advocating for diversification of that relationship to provide investment guarantees, to provide business opportunities and invite investors to invest in Afghanistan to sort of diversify that relationship. And lastly, I think the government of Afghanistan has created the legal environment, a very important development over the last few years. But the tapping of Afghanistan's natural resources is going to be a major encouragement for the investors to come to Afghanistan and utilize this natural endowment. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sidiqee.
If I may also comment on that investment, of course, there's particular question from Mr. Sidiqee. If I may comment.
Yes, please, quickly if possible. Yeah.
Yes, with regard to the investment and bringing investment into Afghanistan, since I'm a mining lawyer and I know about the mining projects and mining sector of Afghanistan. So during past 6-7 years, how many contracts been awarded to the investors? None. How many contracts how many projects have been developed, mining projects? None. So what are the most successful model mining projects in the country? None. INAC is challenged during past 10 years. It's just on the middle of nowhere, not going anywhere. They're stuck. So they keep changing the laws, keep changing the policies. So the mining sector is not a contract of 2-3 years. It's a contract of 30 years. They need legal stability. They need a contractual stability. That's not something that you can change your laws every day. So who will come to Afghanistan if there's no successful mining model project in the country developed and implemented? So who can trust from international mining community will come if there's no successful mining projects? No legal stability, no contractual stability, no software infrastructure developed, no hardware infrastructure developed. So where's the power? We do not have even a sufficient power for the household in the country. So how we can develop and industrialize the country? So I mean, they bringing investment, particularly FDI, requires a soft infrastructure, which is a legal stability, contractual stability, and of course, and the hard infrastructure, which unfortunately it lacks at the moment in Afghanistan.
Thank you very much. We have 2 more questions, and I think they are both to Dr. Joya. And first is asked by Mr. Aziz Ali, and his question is how to reach the poorest of the poor, daily wagers who suffer a lot due to COVID-19, because there is no good data on that, and well, government sort of see other recipients rather than this most neediest part of the population of Afghanistan. Over to you, Dr. Joya.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think, I mean, contrary to Mr. Aziz Ali, I think there is good data in Afghanistan, because the key to designing such programs to support the poorest segment of the population is that you need data, you need information, and you need statistics. I believe that over the past 2 decades, there was quite a successful rounds of very large household surveys in Afghanistan, of course supported by the donors, but when you compare Afghanistan with other countries, not only in terms of the availability of data, but also accessibility and data openness, Afghanistan is much better compared to some other countries in the region, especially some of the Central Asian countries, for which you cannot access data online, for instance. So I think we do have very good data here in the country with the large household surveys that have been undertaken every 3 to 4 years since 2005. The government has implemented a social demographic survey in most provinces. Perhaps I think so far it has covered around 15 or 16 provinces so far. And then the Central Statistics Office also has the household listings for almost all villages in the country. And for those who are familiar with the National Solidarity Project, NSP, that was involved, that was operational since 2003 or 4 in terms of supporting rural development throughout Afghanistan. there is enormous data collected through the NSP project. And even currently, the government is planning to use all those information on community development councils. So in Afghanistan, for the NSP project, the government established community development councils in every village in order to implement the project. And I think that's the best vehicle to use for emergency support programs such as REACH, or even the program, or even sort of a cash transfer program using digital.
Yeah, well, I think we need to decide whether we continue with that or there was one more question actually, but it's all, I think, well, I don't know if Mr. Sidiqee or Mr. Hashimi can answer the third question on what measures do you think the Afghan government will take against the second wave of coronavirus, which asked by Nurgul Ilyasova.
Thank you. Hashimi said, go ahead if you would like to address it.
Okay, thank you so much, Sidiqee Seb. I'm sorry for being so critical about your government, but of course these are the realities, and I have to mention that. It's
not to mention that you work for the government not long ago.
I'm representing private sector of Afghanistan. So, however, about the question, I think what we have suggested at the first time on the first wave of coronavirus coming to Afghanistan, we said there has to be a strategic food stock in the country, and essential commodities and essential products should be allowed to come in immediately, and there has to be ease of custom processing and custom issues at the border, and let them to import those essential products, mainly medicine and the medical equipments. Of course, we already have so many lessons learned from the first wave. We have so many issues that now measures actually have been taken, and so many experience from the first wave. And I believe the second wave would be much easier, and the government and the private sector of Afghanistan and other entities would be much more prepared to respond to the second wave, I believe.
Thank you very much. Yeah, please.
I think in terms of the people, the difficulties that people faced during the first wave, as Mr. Hashimi said, both the private sector and I think all players, the global players, the international partners of Afghanistan, and most importantly, the government of Afghanistan took a stock of every single development and will, of course, consider those if there is a second wave. In terms of people's mobilization, I think this plays a very crucial role, and the government of Afghanistan, the civil society, the media, and the private sector has not stopped informing people about the potential danger of a second wave. People are more aware of the significant dangers of COVID-19, and they are more cooperative with the government taking measures. So the best strategy is, of course, to prevent a second wave. But nevertheless, if such a wave occurs, the government has all the readiness to respond to it in this space, both financial and policy space that we have at our disposal. So the government will try to perform together with the private sector, civil society, and the people of Afghanistan better than it did in the first wave. Thank you.
Rahman, unmute.
Okay. Sorry. Many thanks, Mr. Hashimi and Mr. Sidiqee, for your very useful contributions. Now, I think it's already risky to wait until our Biruni colleagues will connect again. So let me pass the floor to Dr. Bogdan Kravchenko, the Dean of the Graduate School of Development of the University of Central Asia, for the concluding remarks. Thank you very much.
Now, I just want to thank, first of all, it's nice to see familiar colleagues, and I'd like to thank all of the, thank you colleagues for participating in this webinar, and I'd like to thank Omar and his colleague from the Biruni Center. Every time I attend in these kind of events where the problems of Afghanistan are discussed, it all becomes, after 2 minutes, simply overwhelming, where everything has to be fixed up at the same time. And you begin to wonder. And if you have the slightest familiarity with the government, you also wonder about the capacity of the people who are supposed to fix things up. Well, so we're a little bit in the capacity building with our Executive Master's Program at the Institute of Public Policy and Administration. I'm glad to see Omar and your colleague back. I'm just thanking you very much. So it's too bad we can't continue this discussion because I have a couple of questions for you. I think what Mr. Hashimi talked about the mining industry is an exercise in surrealism that I experienced in Afghanistan a couple of years ago when I met people from the Ministry of Mines that was very active, and they had a whole team writing a policy paper on mining. And I said, but have you got any mines? They said, no. Well, you know, come from a country of Kyrgyzstan where Kumtor supplies about 8% of GDP or 3% of GDP, a huge percent of the government budget. And that's because they simply got donor money to do mining policy. And so they did mining policy as opposed to any kind of political lobbying for there to be an environment in the country to actually do mining. Well, okay, and do all of the illegal mining while you're at it, but actually do develop some very good mining. This is such an important issue of capacity, setting the agenda, and the ability to do things. And sometimes it reminds me, and this would have been a question to Omar. We always talk about what governments do. What about what they should stop doing? You know, you could probably increase GDP by a couple of % by having the government just stop doing a couple of things. I certainly could think here of, you know, like 8 things if the government stopped doing, it would be quite a flourishing, you know, it would have a very big impact on the economy. When we look at forecasts for the economy, it's very difficult to sometimes think about that because you don't know what the economy looks like. So if you're talking about forecasts for economy, I begin to wonder about some of this stuff. When in a place like Afghanistan, what would it be? About 80% of the population is self-employed in the informal economy? Probably on that order of magnitude. Now, if that's the case, what are the policies that you need to support these people who you know, that's the way they survive, and they could use this as a kind of way of going forward. So I think these are considerations to go forward. One of the most remarkable things that happened here during COVID was actually what society did. And had it not been for the activity of society, volunteers, the exchange of information amongst people on how to get cured, this would have been a catastrophe here, although it came very close to being a catastrophe. So policies that also release the energies of the population, I think would be something to talk about. In any case, I've monopolized my position of saying concluding remarks. And once again, thank everyone for participating in this in the audience. And let's meet again shortly in another session. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.